All right, I think we should start this stream by saying happy birthday. Should we sing happy birthday to Joe? It's his 40th birthday.
I'm pro singing it. I think you should sing it. I'd like to find out what kind of chops you got.
Okay. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Well, welcome to the stream today, guys. I've got Joe Heschmeyer. I've got Stephen Boyce. And today we're talking about some drama that kind of happened recently. And really what this is it's an excuse to talk about a really cool church father. Okay, there's something that happened. There was a debate between James White and Joe Heschmeyer, who's joining us today. And there were some comments made in that debate that are basically like kind of going viral right now. There's a lot of people talking about these comments from James White about this early church father, St. Ignatius. And it gives us an opportunity to sort of nerd out. We've got Stephen Boyce here, who's an expert on St. Ignatius. So we get to nerd out a little bit on some early church fathers, talk about what they were talking about. And it's just going to be a really, I think, fruitful stream to discuss the comments that were made by James White, but really to talk about this awesome church father, St. Ignatius. If you've never heard about him, what he wrote, why it's even relevant to a debate on the Mass and stuff, you guys, I think, are in for a treat today. So before we get into some clips, which I've got several clips lined up, we're going to play from a debate, and then also James White sort of responded. He yesterday posted a video on his channel responding to the controversy. So we're going to play some clips from that as well and just talk about some really cool things. And this, I want to make it clear at the outset, we were talking about this as we were sort of conferencing and getting ready for today. We're not here to attack James White. Okay. We really do. This is about the truth for us. We want to know whether or not St. Ignatius actually existed. We want to know what he wrote about and if he actually wrote these letters. And that's the point of today, is that we really do care about truth. And yeah, like I said, it gives us an opportunity to talk about some really cool stuff. So, but before we get into the clips, Joe or Stephen, is there anything you guys want to say before we get into it?
I mean, I might just piggyback on what you said. Like, I think it was a pretty clean debate. I know we both interrupted each other. I was actually worse about it, I think. I was super excited. I knocked my light out of the light socket twice because I was like a golden retriever in a debate. But, I think it was, people sometimes have a reputation, have like an image of James White in their head as being like mean and all this in debate. And I didn't think that he was. There were a couple maybe personal attacks on me, my wardrobe, and my wife for letting me out of the house. But after, I think that was joking. And then it was after that, I think he was a perfectly gracious debater. He was definitely offended at the end that I'd pointed out the Ignatian stuff, and he felt misrepresented. And I told him if I did misrepresent him, I was sorry, but I didn't think that I had. He took that as an admission of guilt and has publicly said that I've retracted and said I misrepresented him, which I did the opposite. But I would offer this, like if I have misstated his view. I mean, I was getting it at the same time everybody else had. I'd seen James White numerous times endorse the existence of Ignatius and use Ignatius as evidence when it suits him. And then to have him suddenly become, I guess we might say, an Ignatian agnostic, maybe even an Ignatian mythicist. It sounds like he's at least back to hopeful agnosticism on Ignatius from his more recent video. It was a very fortuitously timed conversion and deconversion. Because it meant that like it was able to derail the debate about Ignatius into this other maybe unfruitful one. But what made me want to still do this, even after watching his video yesterday, was seeing defenders of James White go on places like Reddit and argue, yeah, maybe Ignatius didn't exist and we should take that seriously. And I think we're going to see not a serious view, and it's not helping our understanding of Christianity to mislead people in that.
Well, Stephen, unless you've got something else that you wanted to talk about, this is your first time on Capturing Christianity. Why don't we give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself and then also explain the relevance, your expertise on the topic?
Sure. So, yeah, good to be on. It's been a long time I've watched you, so it's been good to connect and get on here. But, yeah, that was a good debate. I thought it was a healthy debate. Overall, the attitudes were good. There were some points where there was some contention or frustration, but I've seen a lot worse in James White debates. I thought it was a healthy dialogue from the perspective of you guys were actually answering each other's questions for a while. This is one of those places where I feel like it didn't happen. And then honestly, I've known Jane White for a few years now, and that one threw me off. I mean, he and I have done programs together. I've been on his show, and we actually covered a little bit of my dissertation, specifically about Clement of Rome, but from that same manuscript that has Ignatius. And I was a little bit surprised to hear him say it because I was watching it live and almost dropped my jaw on the floor. I was like, what did he just say? Because I thought I heard him wrong at first. Then he kind of repeated it, which you'll show the clip of. And it took everything in me not to message him that night and say, can you please clarify everything that you just said in that debate? Because that doesn't sound like anything you would have ever said. I've heard these arguments from atheists. I've heard these from mysticists. I've never heard that from somebody like you. So it kind of threw me off. I'm attached to Ignatius in a lot of ways because of the manuscript that I did a lot of study on during my doctoral work with Louisiana Baptist Theological Seminary. So I covered Codex H, which has the longer recension. We know the scribe's name. He signed it at the end, sinner and scribe, and he called himself Leo. And he dated around 1056, which it accumulates to our age of 1056. So it's 11th century, and he has the 7 original letters that we would say are the original letters of Ignatius. And in that writing, it is the longer recension. So I was able to study some of the areas of difference between the shorter and middle and kind of look at the differences between the two, the grammar, the syntax, the way he cites the Old and New Testament. So those things were very, very important to me. And for him to bring this up was kind of unfortunate because I would consider Dr. White a friend. I don't know if he would still consider me one, not being in that circle anymore. But I do think this is a healthy discussion for us because I think that at the end of this, he challenged us in his previous video that came out to not do the video. Well, we have a challenge and response, and we're willing to retract a lot of wrong ideas that you say we have. If you're just willing to make the statement, I messed up, I made a mistake, I misspoke, I meant this, and it came out as this, and I realize why everybody feels the way they do, because we're not the only one doing a response video. I've already seen 2. We're not the only ones doing a response video to this. So everybody else is seeming to take away from your debate this point. So Dr. White, I would actually suggest that you retract your statement and not defend it on Twitter or social media in another video. I think it would be wise as your friend to actually just say you misspoke and that you kind of bait and switched when you were asked a question because a question that Joe asked you in the debate never got answered, ever. It was never answered because this became the distraction. And now this is the distraction here. So we got to go back and relive it in order to get everybody on the same page.
Why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and turn now to the clip of what all of this is about, what sort of started this, and then we can kind of go from there and get in some more details. But let's play this clip. It's about 148:58. This is where we're going to be starting this in the debate between Joe and Jane. And this is on the debate was on the propitiatory nature of the Mass. And let's just watch this clip, and then we'll start to talk a little bit more about it.
Here, but 2 things. If we have what Ignatius wrote there, since I was in seminary, and I'm not sure if...
Actually, maybe we should pause here. Joe, tell us what was going on. Set us up the context of what happened here.
So from the very beginning, my argument was crafted along 6 points. And one of the points was that the early Christians, relying on texts like Malachi 1 from the Bible, were convinced that the Mass was a sacrifice, and it becomes very clear from their writings that they believe it's a propitiatory sacrifice. It is a sharing in the atoning sacrifice of Christ, not just a sacrifice of praise. And to the extent that James even kind of acknowledged that debate, it was just to claim, without really giving any evidence for it or argument for it, that this was all anachronistic, because he claimed, no, they didn't believe that this was really the flesh and blood of Christ. And so they couldn't have had a propitiatory sacrifice of Christ, and they didn't have Aristotelian categories of substance and accidents, which you need to be able to have transubstantiation. Now, almost everything in those claims is false. And I tried to press him on that by looking at a couple of the historical sources. St. Cyril of Jerusalem explicitly talks about this changing into the body of Christ and it being a propitiatory sacrifice. He uses that language. He calls it a bloodless service. And so he's describing not just the same reality, he's using the same terminology. This is not some, late thing. He's in the 300s. But then even if you go all the way back to Ignatius, the text I was trying to ask him about was not the famous Ignatius letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 7, where he talks about the real presence of Christ, how the Gnostics or the Docetists abstain from the Eucharist because they don't confess it to be the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ. That's where he thought I was going to go. The question I was actually asking him was completely unrelated. It was about Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians in chapter 20, where he refers to the Eucharist as the medicine of immortality and the antidote to prevent us from dying, but which causes that we should live forever in Jesus Christ. Now, if his view of the Eucharist is like James's, a merely memorialist one, or if he views it just as a sacrifice of praise, what in the world is he talking about? If, on the other hand, he thinks the Eucharist is a sharing in the atoning death of Christ, then yeah, it makes sense to describe the Eucharist as the medicine of immortality that keeps us from dying and causes us to live forever. So that language seems strongly suggestive that the only way to make coherent sense of Ignatius's Eucharistic theology is by the fact that he held to the same thing that later Christians held to, and he just said it in slightly different terms, but terms that the Catechism seizes on. So not even really a different set of terms, and that's what I'm pressing him on. And he doesn't ever answer. Like, even if you think Ignatius didn't write those things, it was a later second century author, the question still remains, if your claim is seriously that no one until, it was hard to pin him down on anything like dates, but seemingly no one until the 11th century believed in any of this stuff, why do we have a second century document that it cannot be dated later than about 180 saying this, and one that he and I until that night, seemingly both agreed, dated to, I said 107, he said 108, and then he took a very different direction with it.
All right, let's continue this clip then and just watch what happens throughout the rest of this period. This is the second cross-ex. Remind me, was this his cross-ex or your cross-ex?
This is my cross-examination of him, and I think that's also important because he accuses me of interrupting him and keeping him from making his point. I think you're going to see two things. One, he makes the false statement immediately. And two, I'm supposed to interrupt him when he's long-winded. He announces there's 90 seconds left, never answers my question, and then uses up the entire clock. So if anything, I maybe should have interrupted him more quickly when he's just eating clock.
I'm going to back up a little bit so that way we can get some more context here.
But because of the defense of these things by the Council of Trent.
If people
Against the
like
reform.
Ignatius in 107 don't believe that the Mass is propitiatory, why is he calling it the medicine of immortality and the antidote to prevent us from dying, but that causes that we should live
There you go. You're talking about the letter to the Ephesians.
forever in Jesus Christ?
Okay, we've only got 90 seconds here, but two things.
So he's got 90 seconds, and this is what he does with those 90 seconds.
If we have what Ignatius wrote, since I was in seminary, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, over the past 25 years, there has been a tremendous amount of skepticism, scholarly skepticism. Okay, let's make sure we don't.
Okay, what is happening here, Joe? What did you drop something?
I was so excited I kicked the light socket out and my lamp went off, and so I had to bend down and plug it back in again. This was the second time that happened. Like, I was high on adrenaline. I have only myself to blame for that, but I was really excited about this conversation and could not calm down enough to just.
There was
like
another point during the debate where you were like, yes, yes, yes. I was like, whoa.
He asked me a really good question. I was like,
easy, buddy.
It was like he was so close to getting the point I was making, and then we just didn't quite touch base. But it was like exactly the question I was hoping he would ask to trigger this realization that, like, his understanding of Hebrews contradicts other things he believes about Hebrews. But that's another discussion.
All right.
Now,
All right,
what we need to keep in mind the question was about the statement about the Eucharist being the medicine of immortality. Let's not lose sight of that, because anybody watching the debate, if you took the bait and switch, you missed that. So let's just kind of keep that in mind as we keep going.
Right, and he's only got 90 seconds. This is what he chooses to do with those 90 seconds.
There we go. The light came back on. There has been a tremendous amount of scholarly skepticism expressed as to whether Ignatius even existed and which letters are actually, because there's a Latin and
Was that you laughing? Okay, that was you laughing on
Yeah,
the
I didn't try
debate,
to. I was
not
like
here.
so caught off guard by that in the debate. I was like, what? Like, that was, I mean, of all the things, I was expecting him to do any number of things to try to do the usual bait and switch. He often will just say, oh, he's responding to Docetus, as if that means we can ignore his Eucharistic theology. But
And we're
going to
get to that, by the way. We're going to get to his claims that it's all about Docetism.
Right. I expected it to go one way. I mean, that was an unintentional laugh of surprise.
Okay.
And there's a shorter, and I was not taught that, but I'm sort of catching up with that. So he's
catching up with the fact that St. Ignatius, there's a lot of people that are sort of skeptical that he exists.
I don't know how. I don't know how he can say, Cameron. I don't know how he can say he wasn't taught that, because he just mentioned the shorter and longer, then he stopped himself. Mm-hmm. If you've been introduced to Ignatius's writings in any seminary work, you've been introduced to the reality that there are different recensions. I don't know how he can say he wasn't introduced to that. Maybe he was, but see, this is where it gets catchy for me. And Joe, I don't know how you felt about it in the initial moment you heard it, because now he's claiming he never said the person didn't exist. He was talking about the corpus, and he used the person in place of the corpus. And then he backtracks that in the debate, and he's saying, I never said the person didn't exist. But now he's saying that, yes, people say he did not exist. And right. I was never taught that. Well, which one is it? Is it you were taught the corpus didn't exist, or the person? Because truly, if you've been introduced to the subject, I know he has. He was introduced from day one, even through Lightfoot's work, that there was a problem in the textual transmission of Ignatius's letters. How many? Which recension? And then, if that's truly what he meant, then why are you defending yourself on Twitter saying that you didn't deny the person's existence? It's one or the other, Dr. White. It's one or the other here. Which one were you not introduced to?
Yeah, I mean, because you will have people who argue Ignatius is like an entirely fictional character. Somebody else wrote those letters and decided to bolster their reputation. He described it to an obscure bishop that apparently didn't write anything. I think that's a silly argument. It also is a fringe argument, and I tried to press him on.
Yep.
If he just misspoke, he happened to misspeak about a real fringe argument. It'd be like saying, well, I think Jesus didn't exist, and what you really mean is I don't think Jesus wrote a gospel. Those two things don't mean the same thing. Or if you want to say, I think a lot of scholars today would say Jesus didn't exist. Because it's true, he doesn't explicitly say this is his own view. But literally the only reason I can think of for why you would throw out this fringe kind of scholarship calling into question Ignatius's existence is to cast doubt on the guy whose theology you disagree with.
Yeah, let's continue this clip here.
I hope Ignatius wrote...
Moss and people like that are taking that view, but it is a fringe view in scholarship.
I hope it's becoming the central view. I hope...
So he says, I hope it's becoming the central view, and that's sort of like an aside. But it's clear that he's still talking about the existence of St. Ignatius. Watch what happens next. What he sort of points to next.
Hope Ignatius existed. And
well, that's it. Yeah. He said it's becoming the central view. I hope that he existed.
Right. Which again, doesn't make sense if he's just saying we have questions about the authenticity of the manuscript tradition. If
right, it'd be like questioning whether or not Paul existed, simply because there's a question about whether or not he authored some of the epistles. Right.
Right. Exactly. There's a difference between saying I don't
think
it doesn't
Paul follow
Second Timothy and saying I don't think Paul really existed.
Yeah, it just doesn't follow at all. And we're actually going to see in the follow-up video that he did, he sort of spells out the reasoning that he's using to get to the conclusion, which is a weird conclusion. It's not just the conclusion that maybe St. Ignatius didn't exist. It's the conclusion that there are some scholars who affirm that. And I don't know where that's coming from. But let's just play this clip. Let's keep going here.
It's a fringe view in scholarship.
I hope it's becoming the central view. I hope Ignatius existed and wrote the things we have. But I'm sorry?
You're saying the central view in scholarship is Ignatius
I'm saying that the expression of that there are people going, did these letters actually have an original form? There are so many forms of it. Why? That's not relevant to our debate right now. I'm simply saying he may...
Right. So
not relevant to our debate.
Right.
So,
And that's the thing that's so hard in the cross-examination is I think when he felt like he was maybe a little bit more on the ropes, he just was refusing to answer straightforward questions by telling these like digression stories that would eat up the whole clock. And
he could have he could have at this point talked about Docetism, how he thinks that Ignatius was mainly just combating Docetism in his writings, right? That's
right.
all he had to say. That's his whole point.
Does he say, I think you're misunderstanding Ignatius? He only undermines whether we can really believe Ignatius was who we believe him to be, and if his writings really are the writings we believe them to be. And so he doesn't actually dispute the meaning of Ignatius. He had he knew he had a minute and a half to answer a really straightforward question. It would take, you can start your clock. I think Ignatius is not trying to settle Eucharistic controversies. He's just affirming the real presence of Christ bodily to people who denied the incarnation. There.
Let's see what he did here, but here's the confusion right here, Joe, because you pressed him further, just for clarity's sake. Are you saying the man Ignatius did not exist? And he now changed it to, no, I'm talking about the original letters and whether or not we have what he originally wrote. But see, at that point, this whole thing would have ended. This discussion probably wouldn't be happening had he went on Twitter later and in his video and not said, I never said the man did not exist. I never said those things.
Right.
You did. And then you changed it once Joe pushed you away from, and this is what James White's followers are defending all over the place right now, which is incredible. It's like, no, he was speaking about the man as in the corpus of the writings reflected by the man. Okay, then clarify that. Why do you keep digging deeper and saying, I never said the man didn't exist? Because there are views, and Joe's right, they're fringe. I've only seen them in more atheistic, skeptic, agnostic circles that deny the existence of Ignatius. Very, very few. And he mentioned a couple of them who question his existence, like Robert Price, like Richard Carrier. These are the types of people that actually would reject the existence of the man. This change right here that just happened when Joe pushed him again, just to be clear, he switched it from the man to his writings. That's where the uncertainty is. That's where we're all questioning, which way you going on this? We're confused.
Right. Yeah, I think a good way to, his whole argument in the debate, if you watch it, almost everything is just his exegesis of Hebrews. I don't think he has much of a second argument beyond if he's right about Hebrews or if he's right about Calvinism. If I had responded, a lot of people don't even think Hebrews belongs in the biblical canon. That would be superficially true, but it would be a wildly misleading thing for me to say in a debate, since the obvious implication of it would be that I'm calling into question the authenticity of Hebrews. And so if you're
trying to cast doubt in the minds of the people that are listening.
Right, exactly. It is a move to cast doubt, relying on atheist, mythicist scholarship in a way that it's a weird move to make as a Christian, regardless of if you're Catholic or Protestant.
Right. And he's on record arguing against other people like, the opposite direction. So why don't we turn now to his latest response, okay? And this one was posted 15 hours ago. And in this section, he's talking about what he would normally do, what he didn't do in the debate with you, what he would normally do. But since of the last few months, he's come across some new things. He decided to do it a little bit differently. But let's hear what he would normally do. Okay.
I knew where I was going. What I was going to do is I was going to say what I said then and what I'll say now and what I'll be able to substantiate, what I'll be able to demonstrate from the text, that what Ignatius is doing is he is providing an anti-docetic argument, a polemic against Docetism.
That took him, 15 seconds, 10-15 seconds.
I mean, it also, for the record, would still be off topic because he's responding to the context of the letter to the Smyrnians. And I'm asking about the letter to the Ephesians, which is not in chapter 20. An anti-Docetist thing. It is a presentation positively of his Eucharistic theology. There's nothing in there about watching out for heretics. He talks about being united with the bishop and having the breaking one and the same bread, which is the medicine of immortality. And so saying Ignatius rejected Gnosticism and Docetism is cool but irrelevant. Like if you let's say somebody wanted to reject the church's sexual ethic, or wanted to reject Christianity's views against fornication, and said, Jesus said a lot of stuff about the Good Samaritan. You'd be like, yeah, that's all true. That doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. But yeah, he also said those things. Well, here, like saying that Ignatius wrote to the people of Smyrna about Docetists doesn't tell us what he's writing to the people of Ephesus about when he talks about the Eucharist as the medicine of immortality. Explaining that away as an anti-Docetist thing, I would challenge any Protestant to form those ideas into a coherent thought that you could defend syllogistically.
Well, let's just say he took it to the Docetism level. The Docetists obviously denied physicality as good. So the counter argument to me would have taken Dr. White actually in a good way for you in the debate,
right? For
your point, because if Docetism denies the physicality of goodness, and Ignatius is buckling down and uses, of all the examples he could have used to debunk the system of Docetism, he chooses the most sacred moment of the gathering of the saints at the Mass to be the illustration of how different they are from those of the Orthodox faith. And he chooses that substitute. And he does this multiple places. This is the part that threw me off a lot, because even if he was talking about the Docetism, then that actually proves the greater point that there's something happening in a physical substance that is spiritual and beneficial and grace-filled that supersedes just a normal human thing. So I don't know, like, where would you have gone? I'm curious. Where would you have gone if Dr. White would have pushed into the Docetism more? Would that have actually worked more into some of your lineup of things you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Like, I've made actually multiple videos on this, that views, like a memorialist view of the Eucharist, basically necessitates you say, on this issue that the earliest Christians were fighting against the Docetists on, the Docetists were right. This is not the flesh and blood of Christ. Because the controverted line in the letter to the Smyrnians, if you want to go that way, he says that these heretics abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer because they confess not the Eucharist to be the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, which suffered for our sins, and which the Father of his goodness raised up again. And then he warns that because they speak against this gift of God, they incur death in the midst of their disputes. It'd be better if they treated it with respect, that they also might rise again. And so if you want to say this is against the Docetists, which absolutely it is, that doesn't mean it doesn't also apply to you, because, if you're a memorialist, you would never say the reason the Docetists are wrong is because they deny that this is really Jesus's flesh and blood in the Eucharist. Because you'd have to say, no, this is actually a point of common ground. We both agree this is just a symbol. We might have totally different avenues for how we got there.
Unless St. Ignatius, I think you kind of pointed this out, Stephen, on the phone, like unless he's just switching his views whenever he finds it appropriate.
Right. Unless Ignatius says one thing to a Docetist crowd and another thing to a non-Docetist crowd. And I think we would expect him to be to have more integrity than that. In the same way, it was surprising to see James White going from endorsing Ignatius to questioning him when an inconvenient part of Ignatius gets brought up. And Ignatius isn't alone on this, by the way. Irenaeus in Against Heresies is writing against Gnosticism, including the Docetist kind of wing, but not limited to them, about the resurrection. And he says in Against Heresies, book 4, chapter 18, how can they say that the flesh, which is nourished with the body of the Lord and with his blood, goes to corruption and does not partake of life? Let them therefore either alter their opinion or cease from offering the things just mentioned. Notice there, he's acknowledging that there's a Eucharistic real presence and an offering, which is, again, sacrificial language for the Eucharist. And then says explicitly, but our opinion is in accordance with the Eucharist, and the Eucharist in turn establishes our opinion, for we offer to him his own, announcing consistently the fellowship and union of the flesh and spirit. So he's taking in explicitly the Eucharist is Jesus' bodily view, and it's an offertory, and saying not, I've adopted this Eucharistic theology for the moment because it's convenient in my fight against Gnosticism, but rather the Eucharist is the foundation from which other views are based. Our opinion is in accord with the Eucharist, and the Eucharist in turn establishes our opinion. I've heard James White denounce the Catechism in the paragraph quoting this as like a later accretion, and this is from 180. I mean, this is probably a year before Athenagoras uses the word Trinity for the first time. It's not a later accretion. And as we see from comparing Irenaeus to Ignatius, they're both using Eucharistic theology to defeat the Gnostics, but Eucharistic theology that people like James White reject.
So one of the things that I think would hurt him too, just going back to Ignatius, he repeated this multiple times. He repeated this idea of his desire. When he's writing to the Romans, for example, he tells them, I desire the bread of God, the heavenly bread, right, which takes us to that illustration of manna. I mean, you're instantly thinking kind of John 6 here, right?
Yeah.
You're thinking that John 6, the bread of heaven. And then he says, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who became afterward the seed of David and Abraham. And I desire to drink of God, namely his blood, which is incorruptible, love and eternal life. And so even when we go through different places, like in Romans, he's not writing against a belief system. He's just telling you his personal desire. My desire at this point, while I'm traveling, I'm being hauled around as a prisoner. This is I miss the Eucharist. I miss it. I want to take the Eucharist. I don't desire temporal things that are decaying. And that was his point. These are corruptible things. Bread is corruptible. So one of your points, Joe, was talking about whether or not something has changed, because that became a big part into this. Well, obviously, if Ignatius is saying that this bread is corruptible, but the bread, which is the body of Christ, is incorruptible, something had to happen to the nature of the substance in order for it to go from corruptible that anybody can eat to the incorruptible that he's looking forward to taking of again. Same thing with the chalice. If this is just corruptible wine that perishes, he doesn't want that one. He wants the incorruptible. So what happened to the substance? And he's not writing against Docetus when he said that. He's just speaking to his personal missings of taking the table with the Romans or the other churches. Mm-hmm. So even in Romans, it goes against what he's saying. And by the way, he talked about the different longer and shorter recensions. Dr. White is a textual critic. He's done a lot of textual criticism. He understands how this works. These lines, these phrases that I just read from Romans is in the shorter recension. It's actually in the Syriac sections of this where we have this portion. That line is in it. It's in the middle recension that I just read from. It's in the long recension, which is in Codex H and a few other Latin. It's in all three. So if you're doing textual critical work here, the way you look at, is this an interpolation? Because there are sections, and to be fair, Joe, one of the sections you read is in the middle recension, but not in some of the others. Right. Doesn't mean it's not right. But this is one of those places where we shouldn't be left with question of, is this probably a part of one of the original works of Ignatius, or an interpolation or a subtraction? Because we have a coherent textual connection between language, transmission, a longer, a shorter, a Latin, a Greek, a Syriac. We now have all of these put together, and that line is in every single one of them. At that point, as a textual critic, Dr. White should pause and go, we have no reason to doubt that line. We have no reason to doubt it because there's no distraction for us. There's no interpolation possibility because there's no variant. But if he were to practice his proper textual criticism in these places, in some of these places like the one I just read, now he has to wrestle with what happened to the bread and the wine, where Ignatius believes one is corruptible and one's incorruptible. How does that happen? What took place? What changed from the corruptible to the incorruptible? I don't know your thoughts on that, guys.
Yeah, I mean, I would just press those 2 points. Like, if this is a response to Docetism, well, number one, even granting that, which it's fair to say for the letter to the Ephesians at points, for the letter to the Smyrnians, what does that mean? You know, again, does that mean he doesn't mean what he's saying? And number two, why is he saying this when he's not talking about Docetism in entire letters or portions of letters that aren't about this? And so then if it's just, you know, so if that's the kind of excuse, I think it's easy to answer. If it's, we don't know what he did and didn't write, if you're only disputing some of the manuscript variants, then we're still on pretty good ground. I mean, on the generally received Ignatian corpus of 7 letters, everything I quoted was from that. On the, you know, as you say with the letter to the Romans, it's on even firmer ground where it's not a disputed passage at all, unless you take the really radical view that maybe none of the letters are real. And again, like, you can't claim that's the mainstream view. And even the people he seems to be citing to don't say this is the emerging majority view or anything of the sort. Like, it's one thing to say you can find scholars out there who deny Ignatius wrote anything. You can find scholars out there who, maybe think Ignatius didn't exist at all. But don't claim that's the emerging majority view when it just isn't, especially if you can't substantiate that. Jimmy Akin pressed him and asked him on Twitter right away, okay, who are you thinking? Like, what scholars do you have in mind when you make this kind of claim? And he seems to have nobody. The only, in the video, his response video there, he cites to Jonathan.
We're still
Lucadou.
waiting on a response to this tweet from Jimmy Akin. I've got. This is the one that Joe was just referencing, so you guys can read it while he's continuing.
Well, I was just gonna say, in the kind of follow up video that James White gave us, he cites to Jonathan Lucadou, but Lucadou points out that it's very implausible that the Ignatian letters aren't genuine. He says if the Ignatian letters are not genuine, it is difficult to imagine why a pseudo-epigrapher would select an otherwise little-known figure to be the mouthpiece for his views. And I'm sure James understands this argument. Like, if you are, let's say you're a 2nd century heretic who wants to claim you found a new false gospel, you're going to call it the Gospel of Peter or Thomas or an apostle. You're not going to call it Mark or Luke because those are obscure figures. And so the fact that we have these 1st century gospels that are ascribed to Mark and to Luke is actually really good authenticity of their reliability, because the people they're accredited to being are too obscure for someone trying to get famous to make up. Like, why would you pretend to be Mark? That's way too random. Well, similarly, if the real life Ignatius said and did nothing memorable, like wrote no letters and was just a bishop in Antioch, maybe martyred, why would you present a bunch of letters and then claim they're from him instead of from Justin Martyr, Polycarp, any of the people who did write things and would be more obvious kind of candidates?
Let's do this. Let's get to just a couple super chats that have been sent in, and then we'll turn back to watch another clip. And this next clip, you guys don't want to miss this next clip. It talks about Polycarp. So, all right, just a couple of these super chats. Thank you guys for sending these in. We'll take these throughout the stream. If you guys want to send in super chat questions or comments, we do read these out live during the stream. May the monad bless y'all. And then Brother Joseph says, glad Sam, and he's talking about Sam Shamoon, is about to clear the air with about this with George Janko today before James White does. So if you guys don't know who George Janko is, he recently did this Christian Avengers podcast, and one of the comments that he made on there was a bit problematic. He was talking about the Eucharist and used the language of dirt, and just not the best comparison. And anyways, so a lot of people have responded to this. I even put out a video responding to it as well, and kind of pointed out some things about John 6 and 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 and stuff. So but apparently Sam Shamoon is going on there with him to talk about this. So if you guys are able to, I would say just say a prayer for Sam about this conversation. Pray that, the Lord be edified and that Jesus Christ be magnified. So, yes, that's really cool stuff. Any comments on that, guys, before we turn to the next clip?
No, I think Sam's doing some really good work. I was kind of late to discovering him. I discovered him through some of his work against Adventism. He was on Miles's show, Answering Adventism, and he's great. So I'm glad that they're also able to hopefully address it in a kind of charitable way. And I think Sam's great at it. Just sort of, he'll call people to task, but it's so clear that he loves them and is trying to do the best for them. He actually got a call during his live stream from George Janko, and he just muted everything and took the call directly. So I was like, okay, great. I admire both of them kind of stepping up and handling that the right way.
That's really cool. Yeah, all right. So in this next clip, James White makes the claim that no other work has the same level of complexity as Ignatius, and this is all tied into the recensions that we were talking about. Recensions just means different versions. There's different versions of Ignatius's writings because there's a sort of extensive manuscript tradition, and so he's talking about how the fact here in this clip that the same level of complexity in the manuscript tradition doesn't really exist, or there's not as many controversies for other church fathers. But let's listen to this clip, and then we're going to get Stephen to come in and give his thoughts.
No one else that I know of, Polycarp, No, you don't have that kind of complexity with books like the Didache or the Apostolic Constitutions or Irenaeus, any of the second century writers, Justin.
So again, he's trying to cast doubt on St. Ignatius because the manuscript tradition is a little bit more complex. Okay, so he's still trying to do this. Like, this is what he's like. But yeah, and then we're gonna test the claim whether or not that's actually true in just a second. But let's just get through this clip. It's another 30 seconds or so.
Now, will you have later forgeries attached to pretty much all their names? I haven't run into a pseudo Irenaeus stuff, but yeah, that was the whole point. Was you had people will use those better known names to get their books going, and so there might be, but to have entire recensions to where you have to identify them as the longer and the shorter and the middle, and they're in different languages and all the rest of this kind of stuff.
Different languages.
Ignatius's epistles are a mess.
All right, Stephen.
I think it's fair to say, and man, if there was a shovel I could show myself digging a hole deeper with right now, this would be my motion to Dr. White. Like, man, I love the man. I do. I mean, he was a huge blessing to me for a long period of time, but I know he knows better than that. Like, he used Polycarp, for example. We have literally sat back with a Greek and a Latin text and had to reconstruct his epistle to the Philippians between Greek and Latin because we don't have a complete Greek text. And we think he has one letter. We think there's only one composition. Some can argue that there may be two from the Latin, or that there is actually more sections that are missing from that letter of the Philippians, and we actually have the limited sections of it. And we don't have anything else to work with. Like, let me put it in perspective. We have a single Latin text that helps us bring in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, along with some Greek fragments. When it comes to Ignatius, we have multiple Greek, including the long recensions. We have the middle recension Greek. We have the Syriac, which is probably 6th, 7th century, that only covers 3 letters, but it's Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans. Those are the 3 letters that are in the Syriac. There's only 3 out of 7 in the Syriac, even though they're earliest witnesses. We also have Coptic fragments. We also have Armenian, though they're very, very late, probably. We also have Latin. So when we're talking about the attestation for Ignatius's writings, we have far more to work with to reconstruct 7 original letters, because that's what we believe happens. I mean, you've got Jerome, you've got Eusebius. They're telling us there's 7. When they're talking about his letters, they even name them. Eusebius goes in and names each one. They're the 7 that we believe to be the original. The question isn't whether or not he wrote 7 original letters. It's which recension is correct. That's when he said the mainline debate is here, that's the mainline debate. Is it the middle recension, the short recension, which can only be debated through 3 of the letters, and then, or is it the longer recension like we see in Codex H, which I spent hours and hours and hours in? I don't think any serious scholar takes the longer recension serious, because there's so many later editions that seem to be combating not just Docetism, but Arianism. So that's obviously later. But when it comes to Polycarp, it is far more complex to defend his letter to the Philippians from a manuscript tradition standpoint and its composition than it is Ignatius. He mentioned others as well in there too. I mean, if you were to look at the Didache, he talks about the word pseudo. He mentioned that in the video. He mentioned it, I think, just in your clip, but I think he said it right before this line too, if I'm remembering correctly. There are pseudo works. Do you realize that the Didache is considered pseudo? It is claiming to be the 12 apostles. I don't know many serious scholars that believe it's 12 apostles, because some pseudo work is not equal to others. And I was blown away that he categorically put all pseudo works together. There are some pseudo works that were done in honor of people, not impersonating them. It's very, very different, and that distinction needs to be made because Eusebius makes that distinction about different writings. He had writings that were considered received but not heretical. I mean, we see this he mentioned nobody else like this. There's a whole second letter designated to a man named Clement of Rome. And I don't know anybody, including Eusebius, who accepts the second epistle of Clement to be Clement of Rome. We believe he wrote the first epistle, and we have good reason. We have good early evidence for it in Greek and in for Latin. He talks about, it's interesting, he mentions Irenaeus. There's no issues there. I was actually debating an atheist just 3 weeks ago, and Irenaeus came up. It came up between two atheists and myself. I was getting ganged up on. And one of the things that they mentioned about Irenaeus is I couldn't trust one of the lines I was quoting from him because it's a later Latin section where there's no Greek fragment of, and there's no way to corroborate that section with other works. It is simply dependent on the Latin, and somebody could have went in and changed it and fixed it later. These are from two atheists. One of his is a mysticist. And so the mysticist and the atheist are telling me, you can't trust Irenaeus in this section in book 5 because it's in Latin. And because it's in Latin, there's no other way to corroborate it. It's an independent manuscript reading on its own. Therefore, you can't trust that's what Irenaeus actually wrote. See, what he just did by making this claim, Cameron, is blowing my mind because you're using arguments I'm used to combating against the skeptics. And I'm sure he's used to using these against skepticism.
Right.
It's weird.
Right. I mean, this is the same type of stuff that's brought against textual criticism. Like, look at all of these variants that we have, right, in the textual, in the manuscript tradition. And the reason why we have all of these variants, what a lot of people will point out, like David Wallace, is like, well, it's because we have so many variants. It's because the textual the textual tradition is so vast. That's why it's difficult. That's why there's variance. That's why, there's difficulty here and there's complexity here. It's because we actually have multiple sources that we're working from, and that's what gives the complexity. So it's actually, what seems like a bad thing is actually a good thing. It's a good thing that we have the evidence that we have. So yeah, it's just
But it also shows the popularity of Ignatius. We have so much of Ignatius, and this is what Joe was alluding to earlier. We have so much of Ignatius, and he was such a popular figure. That's why people started creating writings between him and John and him and Mary, and then we see all these other letters that come into play. By the way, the same thing happened with Justin Martyr. There are pseudo-Justin works that are attributed to him that are a part of the corpus that is under dispute. There's individual letters. There's rebukes against Justin. The question then becomes, we can do this with every single church father, and if we go to
the apostles, if you don't mind me jumping in, like
sure,
you can find the Gospel of Thomas. That doesn't mean that Thomas isn't really an apostle. You can find the Proto-Evangelium of James. It doesn't mean we throw out the Epistle of James. Saying somebody else wrote a fake work and ascribed it to this Christian author doesn't undermine their authentic work. So that's just on the pseudoepigraphical side. On the textual transmission side, the more important a writing is, the more people are going to copy it down, the more likely it is you're going to find variation. So you're right. Like, if this was an obscure author who wrote one thing and one person copied it down, all we would have was that one person's recollection, and we'd have to hope it was right. But if we've got a bunch of different versions of it, that actually gives us the tools to get a more reliable reconstruction. I mean, it also gives people the tools to debate that endlessly and get doctorates. But, I wouldn't throw out something because it is well attested.
What I think it needs to be distinguished too, as what I said, pseudo doesn't always mean evil intent to corrupt the people and trick. There are two distinctions that Eusebius likes to make. The Didache, by definition, is pseudo. It claims to be the 12. So it is not the 12 because by the point it was written, most of the 12 were already killed. So it couldn't have been the 12. We see this in the Muratorian fragment, for example. It talks about the wisdom of Solomon, that it wasn't Solomon himself who compiled this text, but that it was the friends of Solomon who maintained traditional teachings of his. So they were actually doing it in honor to him by naming it after him. And so we see this in some pseudo works, that people actually produce something in honor. Whereas, like you mentioned, the Gospel of Thomas, which I spent a lot of hours on those 114 sayings, I may add. When you look at the Gospel of Thomas, it is clearly trying to lure you into a new theology about Jesus, because in the sayings Gospel of Thomas, he is pulled aside when Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am?" The same proclamation we see in Matthew and Mark, where Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That moment is stolen from Peter in the Gospel of Thomas. Rather, Peter answers wrong. Matthew speaks up and answers wrong. Thomas says, "I know who you really are, but my tongue can't speak the words." And then Jesus pulls him aside in secret and gives him these secret sayings. And they're like, "What did Jesus tell you?" And he said, "Well, if I told you, then you would stone me, and then the stones would catch on fire and kill you back. And so you have like this whole thing, like new revelation that Peter thought he knew about Jesus was actually wrong, which I think is a criticism of Mark, and that Matthew speaks wrongly. And so don't listen to Matthew's account. Rather, you need to listen to this account by Thomas, because he was actually the one that was given secret knowledge on the side, and Peter and Matthew got it wrong all along. So now you have competing. So there's a huge difference between the two, with the example you used, Joe, with Thomas, say that, versus the Didache, extremely orthodox and dedication to the apostles. I think we need to make those distinguishing differences, and I think he made them too blanket statement in his statements about these pseudo works.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction.
Let's get to another super chat really quickly from Lewis. Is Wes Huff still ducking Cameron and Joe? I wouldn't use that terminology. I just haven't heard from him. Okay. In the past, I was hearing from him, but I'm just unfortunately not hearing from him now.
I mean, he's gotten very busy, so I'm hoping it's just
true.
Well, I talked to Wes today. Okay. So there's a lot going on that people don't know. So like, just, I don't want to say trust me, because you don't need to trust me, but like there's more going on in his life right now than people will know that I'm not going to share his life story to people. It's not my place to do that. But he's not ducking. That's all. I'm going to leave it.
I'm glad you said that. I don't know the man at all. I know he's busy. That's pretty much the one thing I know. And it's easy to forget that when you're bored online, the people you're waiting to like create content for you may be having the opposite problem of wishing they were bored online, because they're dealing with real other things.
There's real issues in his life that I think people should be praying for more than anything. And it's not like super, super terrible. Like he didn't do anything stupid. It's just, it's real life. We're humans. We deal in a frail world of sickness and problems. And I just got done talking to him today and checking in on him and his family. And so just like, he's not ducking, I promise you. And he's traveling too. He's had to cancel a couple of meetings for some problems that have come up. So like, just so you know, there's definitely no avoiding here.
Yeah, I just got an email from someone making sure I wasn't mad at them, because I'd missed like 2 or 3 emails trying to set up an interview because I was getting ready for the debate. So I'm very sympathetic to, and I mean, I got a fraction of the attention that Wes got for, the debate on Saturday has something like 63,000 views. His Joe Rogan interview has, several times that. And so I'm sure he's just feeling the deluge.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate you making that clarification. So, yeah, let's move on to another super chat. Modern Miracle says, can you all address Ruslan saying Catholics believe the molecules change during consecration, and please inform him of his misunderstanding of transubstantiation. So I want to say that he did a follow-up stream with Michael Jones, and he joined him, and Michael Jones sort of set the record straight. I don't know if you guys watched that, but Michael Jones...
No, I missed all of this.
Yeah, so it
Inspiring
was
Philosophy, Michael Jones, or the other?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I watched it. I was supposed to be on that, but I double booked that day and couldn't join him. But it was good. He did clarify. Go ahead, Cameron.
No, that was it. He did clarify, and Ruslan had accepted it. So it's not a big deal. Like he just either misremembered or and this is referencing the conversation on George Janko's podcast where they were. There was a section where transubstantiation came up, and it seemed like Ruslan was implying that Catholics and Orthodox believe that the molecules change, and that's just false. Like that's not the view. And Michael Jones clarified, and he brought in the Aristotelian terminology, talking about essential, the substance and the accidents, and so there's it's not that the molecules change, and I think that Ruslan is. Up to speed now. He's up to date in his theology there. So yeah, that is taken care of. Let's get to this is probably one of the most important clips of the video that James just put out. This is really unfortunate screen grab, but this is one of the most important clips from this response that he did. Okay, and this one he claims that Joe misrepresented him in his closing statement, and then clarifies that all he said is that some people doubted that Ignatius existed. And he kind of gets into the reasoning that he thinks is going on behind the scenes in the scholarly realm of why some scholars think that St. Ignatius didn't exist. So let's just watch this clip. Okay, it's about a minute long.
Went from there. Then in the closing statement, he went last because he went first. That doesn't always work that way, but it did in this particular debate. And the problem is when you have last, you get to say whatever you want, and you're not going to have any rebuttal. And I felt that Joe Heschmeyer really, took advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Joe, you're a very bad person for
you sly
person. Taking advantage here.
I talked about his apparent agnosticism on the existence of Ignatius, but it was very clear to everyone watching. I was responding to this new statement he'd made. And so it wasn't like I was claiming to have some secret information. Like, yeah, it sounds like the guy just said he doesn't think Ignatius exists, but he hopes he does. And if that's not what he's saying, great. But to accuse me of misrepresenting him on purpose because I'm the last one,
yeah,
I just say go back and watch, because after the closing statements, that's not actually the end of the debate. We then have half an hour of Q&A, and if you watch, the Q&A is actually set up where every time you're asked a question, you get a minute. The other person has 30 seconds. Just make a little tally. Count the number of times James presents some new claim against Catholicism that he had not previously made, and that is not the question that he was being asked. He does it repeatedly, and I literally can't respond at that point. At one point, I even asked the moderator if I'm allowed to respond because he's just brought up a completely new argument, and I'm told no, which is, fair enough. Those are the rules. But he repeatedly did the thing he accuses me of doing. I responded to something he made in cross-examination, not some new argument I'm making. And if he doesn't like the way that I understood what he said, he could have answered my question or made any number of other claims instead.
That's a good point. I mean, there is sort of a double standard that's going on here, but yeah. Stephen, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I thought that
before we continue,
I was kind of surprised, and I knew it, and I told you guys this earlier. I knew when he got up to give his closing, when he made the statement that Joe kept interrupting him, that he had lost the debate, because he had already started excuse making for why he didn't answer certain things, as if there wasn't a long cross-examination, as if there wasn't a Q&A from the audience, as if there wasn't a Q&A from people online. I thought it was really interesting that he took the "I lost, so let me start my excuse" war in his first line of his closing. I mean, you had 5 minutes. I think the closings were 5 minutes. You had 5 minutes to say whatever you didn't get to say to Joe or correct Joe. That's what a closing is, a free-for-all. You can take any point of the debate. You can start something new. It's not smart. It's not wise. I wouldn't advise it. It's not a good tactic. He could have done anything, but he spent the first minute of his 5 making an excuse for why Joe kept talking over him, and then he buckles down on that in this statement here. It's like you had 5 minutes to say what you felt like you didn't get to say to Joe. You could have started out 1 minute. I didn't get to say this because I got interrupted, so I'm saying it here. Line 2, 2 minutes. Joe, you interrupted me here. I'm going to say it here. Because while somebody's interrupting you and while these questions, he could have wrote down, and he does, Dr. White does this, he marks notes and things like that. He could have given himself 5 minutes and took a minute to take the 5 biggest things that made him mad that Joe interrupted him on and made full declarative statements about each one of those interrupted moments in that 5-minute closing. That's what a closing is for. So if this is really how he felt about it, he should have done that in the 5-minute closing. I've been a part of a lot of debates. There's a lot of things I didn't get to say because of circumstance, time, rules, that I was able to finally just put it all out there in a closing.
Yeah, look, I'm a Chiefs fan, so what I'm about to say is extremely biased, but people constantly complaining about the refs, they don't do that if their team wins. And,
they don't do that if their team wins.
It's a sign that you don't think that you're doing well if you start turning ad hom or complaining that it wasn't fair. But, as I said before, in cross-examination, the questioner has the floor to ask questions. Now, he was making claims. If you go back and watch when he's supposed to be asking me questions, he's giving a speech about, bishops and presbyters being the same thing in Scripture. And I'd say, no, I don't accept that framing. Because if you let someone just roll in 6 unchallenged assumptions into their question, you then either have to try to remember all 6 of those things at once, or you'll invariably forget some of them, and then he'll claim, look, we don't even disagree. Bishops and presbyters are the same thing in the Bible, but Rome says that they're different things. And so you have to, when someone is abusing the format of a question, you do have to challenge when they're building in false assumptions or making statements.
What's funny is that that's the exact thing that James White was complaining about in his debate with Dale Tuggy. So in the cross exam, I don't know if you watched that, Stephen. I don't know if you watched. Did you watch the whole debate between the two of them? Yeah, that's what he was complaining about. Because at the end of so Tuggy would ask a question, then James White would respond, and then Tuggy would make a declarative statement and then ask his next question, as if he could just make that declarative statement and then not have James White respond to it. And James White was like, "You need to stop doing that. Like, this is supposed to be cross-exam. Right. Don't just make a claim. You're supposed to be asking me questions." Yet, what Joe's saying is that that's what was happening here. Exactly what is happening here.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe I could have just called them out for that, but I tried to just answer the unchallenged assumption so they would be at least challenged. So someone, look, this is a room full of Reformed Baptists. There were like 5 or 6 Catholics in the room. And so he's saying false things that he knows they're going to just accept. And so it's worth at least saying, like, hey, this thing you just think is a given in Scripture isn't. Even if I don't have time to defend that, like, at least know, yeah, I don't think presbyter and episcopos mean the same thing, and that there's a reason there's 2 sets of biblical terms.
I actually have a clip pulled up where we can kind of get through that if we have time. Sure. It looks like we may have time. Yeah, he makes the same claim here in this video a little bit later on. So I've got that queued up. We can talk about it. Stephen, it looks like you wanted to say something.
No, I was just going to say that you were trying to bring it back to the relevance of Ignatius, which I don't think you ever got to go into, because Ignatius actually distinguishes those roles. So
he does. And I tried to say that to him. Yep.
Let's wait on that. Let's wait to get into that until we play the clip a little bit later on. Yes, that is very important. What I was going to say though is that it seems like James is sort of attributing bad motives to you. And I want to say, like, this is the explanation that comes to mind, is that it's sort of a projection. James White has done a lot of debates. Okay. He knows, like, very clearly, like there was other debate tactics that I think a lot of people watching this noticed on James's part. Like, there was a lot of filibustering. There was a lot of throwing in different jokes and stuff to sort of run down the time. And even in the section that we watched, like he could have made the point very quickly, but then he wanted to start to doubt the existence of St. Ignatius, which was totally unnecessary. And apparently, like, James White doesn't even, he's not even close to accepting that view. So then why bring it up? And so there were definitely debate tactics that were going on in this. And so it seems like, because this is kind of what James White does in his debates, is he's got these different tactics. He thinks that that's what was going on in your mind and really what was happening in your mind is, you're like, this is what he said, so I'm just kind of repeating what he said and I'm trying to address it. Right?
Yeah,
it wasn't that you had this. It wasn't that you were like, oh yeah, I get to go last, and so I'm gonna just, I'm gonna destroy.
This was also like my
James
first time doing a live in-person debate as a Catholic apologist. I've done some online ones, but here I'm doing it live. It's in a Reformed Baptist church. And it's James White, who's famous / notorious for his kind of debate style and kind of rolling over people. And so I was excited and I was full of energy. And I mean, enough that I kicked the power cord out twice on the light. That's not a tactic. I'm not, yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you this, Joe. Who picked the format? Because I know Jeremiah Nordier, he's a friend of mine he was the moderator, Reformed Baptist. So you were in a Reformed Baptist home field with a home field moderator who did a good job, by the way.
He did. I thought he did a very good job.
Who picked the format?
I actually proposed the format because I sent over, as you said earlier, this was all done without a ton of time to prepare. It was January 22nd when we agreed to the debate, at least on like the resolution and everything. And so he had invited me like a week before. I kind of kicked it around. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea, especially because, this was his 295th debate. He can do this stuff on autopilot. He doesn't seem to feel the need to do any further research on these topics. And so he already knows what he's going to say. I've got to do all the work because I don't have a pre-written script. I don't have, 200 debates to just rely on. So I'm having to do a bunch of work. And so there were a lot of topics where I was like, I don't think I can reasonably do that in time. while also, being a father of 3 kids and traveling and moving offices and doing 2 podcast episodes a week. So I sent over like 8 different resolutions that I thought I could reasonably do in time that would be good ones. And he countered with the one we ended up doing, which was very similar to one I'd proposed, but he adds the word propitiatory to make it more like his prior debates. Fair enough. So he's able to do what he's comfortable already doing. I've already signaled I feel comfortable to do that. And then Jeremiah asked me what I wanted to do for structures. And I said, I just did this kind where we didn't have rebuttals in this online debate. And it actually turned out, in my view, a lot better just doing cross-examination. Rebuttals, like, this is maybe too in the weeds. The problem with a rebuttal in a live debate is you don't have time to write a good rebuttal. So you either have something that you've pre-scripted, which isn't going to be responsive, or you're just constantly doing the he said this, I say this form, which is not a great format, or you're just creating a whole bunch of new arguments that you didn't make before. So there's no form of rebuttals I've found that actually helps a debate go well.
Unless you're William Lane Craig, he just seemed to always do really good in his rebuttals.
Fair enough.
Well, he had done so much preparation for all his debates that he had what are they called? Not scripts, but something ready. Briefs. He prepared briefs for every single way that his opponent could go, and so he just basically pulled out the briefs, which was on like an index card, and put it in order. And unless you're that prepared, it's just I think you're right, Joe. It's like it'd be better to just go straight to cross-exam.
Well, the only reason I asked the question was because usually both debaters have to come to an agreement on the format. If you both came to an agreement on the format, what's the point in complaining about it at the very end of the debate? Who went first? Who went second?
Well, I actually thought I was maybe walking into a problem because James White is a formidable debater. So it was like, I know I'm setting myself up for 30 minutes of potentially deep dive questions on, passages that he's spent years and years and years debating. Like it was very aware to me in my mind, like he could pull out some angle on this that I didn't think to prepare. And so, I prayed and fasted that wouldn't be the case. And it turned out there was nothing that he asked that was particularly off the wall. Most of what he asked is stuff that he'd asked before.
So let's go ahead and continue here. Then we're this clip is only a minute long, and we've only played like 15 seconds of it.
Oh,
so
sorry.
let's listen. Let me kind of remind the audience of what we're actually listening to here. So White claims that Joe misrepresented him in his closing statement, and then he clarifies that all he said is that some people doubted that Ignatius existed. That's the part of this clip we haven't played yet, and it's one of the more important parts of his response here because he does double down.
And I felt that Joe Heschmeyer really, took advantage of that inappropriately. And he basically said that I'm a Ignatian mythologist. I don't think Ignatius existed. And I had not said that. I had said that
Did you say that?
I might have said that jokingly at one point. I mean, or half jokingly. I mean, he did sound like he was saying,
why bring it up in the first place?
I hope he exists. And so, again, like I am just saying what it sounds like he's arguing for. Let me put it this way. Like, my wife is not a suspicious person, so this is not reflecting anything in real life. But if my wife said, hey, are you talking to other women? And I said, a lot of people believe ethical non-monogamy is the best way to have a relationship. Technically, I haven't said, like, I'm cheating on you. But the reasonable inference a person would take is, like, why would you bring that up if you were just trying to say, I reject that view, but I didn't get to that part. Why would you say that to a clear question?
Or imagine if you had said in response, I hope I'm not cheating on you.
Yeah, I hope. I hope that Sarah's a guy's name.
Yeah.
I don't have a friend named Sarah. That seemed like a safe one. Like that, the whole way he answered, if what he meant to say is, I believe Ignatius wrote, and I don't think he wrote against my view of the Eucharist. He didn't say any of those things. He said something that seemed to insinuate a great deal of skepticism about the existence of Ignatius or his corpus.
All right, let's continue.
Current discussions have led some people to believe that Ignatius didn't even exist. And obviously,
So who is he talking about here? So it's led some people to question whether or not St. Ignatius exists. Who is he talking about? Is he talking about Robert Price?
I don't know.
Richard Carrier?
I
People
tried to
that
throw
he
in the
does
name,
not take seriously?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure I'm not even sure these people would be dogmatic about it. They would just say the probability is that. I don't even think they would say he doesn't. So this becomes, that's what I'm saying, like, these are tactics the other side of the argument he usually is using, and now he's using their tactic. It's mind-blowing.
So I've actually emailed scholars about this. I can't reveal who they are, but I've emailed scholars, and they've told me, like, there are no scholars. There are no Ignatian scholars that literally doubt that Ignatius existed.
Let me just ask ChatGPT right now. Which scholars deny the existence? Hang on, I got to spell existence right. St. Ignatius.
By the way, while he's looking that up, the reason that they wouldn't be is because his companion wrote about him in his letter, Polycarp, which now can be questioned too, I guess. Irenaeus, right down after Polycarp, mentions him. Origen in his commentary of Song of Solomon and Luke mentions him. Jerome talks about him, his martyrdom, his ministry, his letters. Eusebius mentions his during the time of Trajan. These things happened. He was taken. He was killed. He was martyred by wild beasts. He wrote 7 letters to these churches, and he tells you almost in which order they were written. So we have so much there. We have a lot of reasons. The church believes to have portions and relics of his remains. So there's a lot of reason to not deny it. So most people would never even go that way because there's early companionship. There's later writers who are using his work, calling it his. It'd be hard to disprove him as a person.
But then why bring it up in the first place? Like,
I mean, look, I think the maybe the most charitable interpretation I can think of is he was losing, he panicked, he said something silly. Or, I don't know. I mean, and if he just said that, I think everyone would understand that. Like, hey, this is not how I thought the evening was going to go. I panicked and I overstated something. But the fact that he continues to try to do this, and rather than just take the L and move forward, I don't know. It's such a strange way to go.
We've all said things in debates that we wish we could take back.
I'll own one right now. And so Jeremiah Nordier, the moderator, I had debated him on Sola Scriptura. And in that debate, I overstated the patristic consensus on the interpretation of Hebrews 4, that the two-edged sword, the word of God sharper than any two-edged sword. I had said, oh yeah, the church fathers were unanimous on viewing that as Jesus rather than Scripture. That's not true. I was misremembering the scholarship. It was that overwhelmingly they view it as Jesus, not Scripture. But there are outliers, including, I think, St. Ignatius. So significant outliers. So I way overplayed my hand unintentionally and had to eat it. It's embarrassing, but it happens in a debate when you're on the spot and you're trying to remember information. Mm-hmm. So if he just said, this is what happened, certainly anyone who's ever done public speaking or debate or an interview knows, sometimes you say dumb stuff where your brain just, goes up. You don't expect it to.
He's about to get into the sort of inference that's going on maybe in his mind of why St. Ignatius didn't exist, or why some scholars, some people think that St. Ignatius didn't exist. So let's get to this part of this clip, and then we'll move on to talking about the distinctions between the different ecclesial offices. Let's get to this.
Have led some people to believe that Ignatius didn't even exist. And obviously, if the origination of the sources isn't until the late 2nd century,
So the origination of the sources isn't until the late 2nd century.
To insist Ignatius was bishop of Antioch at the beginning of the 2nd century and he was martyred at the beginning of the 2nd century, well, then he didn't write those things.
And then from there, it's supposed to follow that St. Ignatius didn't exist.
When he says the origination of those sources, what does he mean by that? Because Ignatius calls himself the bishop of Syria in his letter to the Romans. And so this is also like when people claim, there must not have been a bishop in Rome because Ignatius doesn't mention the episcopacy in his letter to the Romans. It's not true. He talks about himself being the bishop of the Syrians and assumes that they have a monoepiscopal governance. So they understand there's only one bishop, but neither here nor there. That's just at the level of, unless he's saying we can't trust anything in Ignatius to know who Ignatius is, and have to look at the later stuff like Irenaeus. I don't know. I'm not sure where he's going with that.
Saint Ignatius of Antioch just commented and left a super chat.
Hey, see?
Wow.
He does
He said,
exist.
Not sure if it was panicking. I think at best White was poisoning the well.
I mean, like I said, I'm trying to take a charitable interpretation of him.
Yep.
White, he's someone who's a disciple of Jesus Christ who's going to have to stand before our Lord someday. And so I don't want to assume that he would sacrifice truth for the sake of, trying to skew a debate. That's just, I hope that's not the case.
Let's get to a couple more super chats here. Theosophical Wanderings, if you don't know who that is, it's John Cranman. It says, Joe, would you be willing to debate me on the canon or Sola Scriptura? I'll say I would be willing to host a debate on Sola Scriptura between the two of you if you were interested.
I would be really excited about doing a debate on the canon, but I'm going to be totally honest. I don't know who the best person. I've had like 3 different people ask if I would debate them on the canon. I'm probably not going to do 295 of the same debates. So I want to be sort of smart about who I say yes to. So I've been a little coy about my dance card, but not on purpose. I think I'm just trying to figure out in fact, if people want to propose who they would really like to see me debate, because I already got attacked on Twitter for debating James White by other Protestants who wish I debated a different Protestant instead. So,
yeah. And people
I don't know. I guess that's just one of those things where if people can point to a Protestant where they would say, if you win this debate, that'll actually impact my thinking about the canon, I would debate that person like in a heartbeat.
John Meade, I know that's like someone who Wes Huff really holds in high regard, and then Gavin Ortland as well. That'd be great. I'm trying to get in contact with him.
Like Meade,
right.
Meade's a good guy. He's completely wrong on some of the canon stuff, but he's a smart guy. I did a video on Seamus Popery responding to him and Wes Huff on this question of the canon. I'd be honored to debate him, and he seems like he's a good dude.
Yeah, but
John's a great guy.
He's a great guy. Not everyone does debates, so if he's not into that, then no big deal. Let's get to this last super chat, and then we'll turn to that clip that I was promising you guys. Sergeant Adhesive says, I laughed out loud when Joe brought up James' debate with Gary Matitix. Brilliant.
I mean, it wasn't
Jerry
punched on the
Gary?
bingo card
Jerry.
yet, so someone had to do it.
Just remind the audience of what happened there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so James had done this exact debate, is the mass propitiatory sacrifice with Jerry Matitix. And if you listen to a lot of James White's stuff, he mentions this debate with a certain frequency. And so it had become sort of a running joke on Catholic circle. Yes, kind of a meme that when James debates a Catholic, he's going to mention Pope Francis. He's going to mention the Jerome Bible commentary. He's going to ask who is the blessed man. And he's going to mention all these debates he had back in the 90s. And so, that's... We covered a lot of that ground. We didn't cover all that ground in the debate. So I think I was ready to talk about this Jerry Matitix thing, because there were some unchallenged things he said in that debate that were just really untrue. Like he seems to say transubstantiation is not a thing early Christians believe in, and it comes from Aristotle. And I know you aren't wanting me to hijack this. I'm about to hijack this for a second. The first use of transubstantiatio is in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Aquinas won't be born for another 10 years. Albert the Great, who popularizes Aristotle in Europe in a big way, is 15 years old. And 5 years before the Fourth Lateran Council, the University of Paris, the premier seminary in Europe, forbade the teaching of Aristotle's natural theology and all this because of controversy over the existence of an eternal world and all this stuff. All that's to say, the church in 1215 is not very heavily Aristotelian. So the idea you need Aristotle to have substance as a category is not true. The idea that transubstantiation is a definition about substance and accidents, you can look up the Fourth Lateran Council and see there's no reference to accidents. The only word you need is the word substance, substantia, which the First Council of Nicaea talks about when it says that the Son is consubstantial with the Father. So the only theological category you need is an explicitly Christian category from the 4th century. So there you go.
All right, moving on to the next super chat. Answering Adventism. No worries. White needs to go amend his books where he cites Ignatius to support the deity of Christ. His current arc is embarrassing. Yeah, no, he actually cited Ignatius in his debate with Dale Tuggy. That's something that Sam Shamoon pointed out, and I went and listened to that debate. And yes, indeed, he does cite Saint Ignatius. He uses some really strong terminology. He's like, oh yeah, Saint Ignatius demolishes that argument. And it's like,
in one of his talks on Ignatius, he argues that the only argument anyone could raise against Ignatius is that he was a modalist, and then he argues that he wasn't a modalist. So yeah, it does seem like he no longer agrees with his earlier stuff. I'd be interested, honestly. I mean, I would love to hear other areas where James now acknowledges he was wrong. If he's on a journey, I'd love to know what that journey is. I hope it's not a journey where he just questions all of the early Christian documents, because I don't think that ends well for someone's Christian faith. Because once you start playing that game with the New Testament scriptures, it's not good.
Yeah, it'd be easier to admit he's wrong in this debate than have to retract all of his statements using Ignatius in prior debates, books, articles, blogs, Alpha and Omega ministry shows. Like, you got to do more retracting in all of that by saying, I just won't use Ignatius ever again. I was wrong to use him the whole time, than saying, I misspoke in the debate. Like, to be easier apology, just say I misspoke, than to have to retract all of your defenses with Ignatius through all your debates, all your articles, all your shows. Like, and to me, I don't think he really believes that about Ignatius. I really don't. And the guy that he's reading, Jonathan, he doesn't give us any reason to doubt the authenticity that we have Ignatius' writings. He does the Christology out of it. I mean, he puts into question everything that all scholarship is doing on these. That's why I'm sitting there for hours and hours 6 years ago looking at the longer recension versus the shorter recension versus the middle recension, and I'm looking at all the differences because everybody's interested in that. I don't think anybody's debating whether or not we have words from Ignatius, writings from Ignatius. As far as the main line goes, we're all struggling with that. And there's so many places where Ignatius said these things that he could have, you picked the Smyrnans, you could have picked the Romans, you could have picked Ephesians, you could have picked many places to go to. So to me, this was just a bad move. It was a bad move on his part, and he can stop this. He can stop the bleeding immediately by just saying, you know what? I went back and listened to the video. I did make it about the person not existing instead of the corpus. I misspoke. And now that we're talking about the corpus, there are issues in the corpus that anybody that studies this understands. And by this, we're going to have to be cautious in places, but not so skeptical that we deny the existence of any teachings from Ignatius at all.
Right.
If he were to do that, honestly, most people would respect him and move on. We'd get over it real quick.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know, it's fine to say there are people who question whether Lightfoot and Zion accurately settled the Ignatian thing. It looked like it was settled. Some people are questioning that settledness. And Jonathan Lucadou, in his book, The Christology of Ignatius of Antioch, this is a guy that James cites to, argues that the current rate of dates offered for Ignatian letters ranges from roughly 105 to 180. So it's not like he's claiming these are medieval forgeries. This is a second century document that was accepted as authentic by the early Christians. The question of whether the author of it was actually the Bishop of Antioch, while relevant in some contexts, isn't actually relevant in the context of what our debate was, which is, how can you say this theology didn't exist in the second century when here's a source from the second century endorsing this theology? Saying that source may not have been the Bishop of Antioch is a non sequitur.
Well, we have a whole entire book of our New Testament designated to Paul being dragged to Rome.
Right.
That being the book of Acts. And Paul didn't write it, but we still believe the account of it is right. So what if somebody else that knew Ignatius, wanted to maintain his legend, wanted to maintain what happened to him, had these letters or had these teachings or had these statements that he made to these churches, and they decided to collect it for him and tell the story of his journey of being in prison from Syria all the way over to Rome? How's that any different than what Luke did for Paul? I mean, it's no different. It doesn't take away the authenticity of it just because even if somebody else ended up writing it for him. It's still his story. It's still true. There's no reason to be overly skeptical on this.
Yeah, a lot of the dating stuff is also really in the weeds. So
Very.
Lucadou also points out that we have a 6th century source that would put Ignatius's death not in 107, but in 113. Now, I can't imagine a context where that is going to be a relevant point for anyone other than an Ignatian scholar. Like it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like saying, oh, maybe Jesus didn't die in 33. He died in 32. Checkmate, Christians. Like that is not something we have to really sweat. Like when we're looking at ancient sources, and I'll defer to you on this one, Stephen. When you're looking at ancient sources, there's a certain level you can know for sure, and a certain level you know only probabilistically because you've got evidence that they don't have meta tags.
Well, we usually try to work within a 25 to 50 year period, give or take. So if you're talking about a manuscript or a dating or something like that. The same thing is true of Polycarp's life, by the way. Some would say he died in the 150s. Some would say he died earlier in the 120, 130s. There's about that 20 to 30 year gap, even with Polycarp too. It's not like we're only dealing with this as Ignatius. This is why I couldn't believe what Dr. White said earlier when Cameron was playing the clip. Like, we don't have this problem with Polycarp. Yes, we do. Like, we most certainly do. We have an issue with the dating of his death. We have an issue of what he said in his death, because there's a whole entire martyrdom of Polycarp account. We have issues with his own text. We have this issue with everything. So if Dr. White wants to go down this road, and I pray he doesn't, you're going to have to start deconstructing your view of every single patristic and early church father all the way up to the time that Christianity was legalized in the 4th century. And now you're going to have to really do a lot of what atheists and skeptics and agnostics are doing about our text and put a giant question mark over anything and say, we'll never know. We'll never know. And I don't think he wants to go there. I just don't think he wants to go there.
All right, let's play this clip now. We're going to turn to where White claims that pastor, elder, and bishop are the same office. All right, let's play it.
Trallians, the letter to the Trallians, chapter 9, section 9, it's not really a chapter, begins, let me see where, is there, the mercy, no, I just want to make sure this is where I want to start.
Take your time.
Yeah, I think I actually posted Trallians 9 recently because it's so beautiful, but we'll get to it. I don't want to get in the way here.
It's beautiful and fake.
So he addresses the bishop, Polybius, and he's writing to the church of Smyrna, and he is exhorting them to stay in fellowship with the bishop. And you might go, well, it's different than what you believe. No, obviously, pastor, elder, bishop are the same office in the New Testament. Joe said otherwise, but it's very easy to prove from when Paul uses the same term interchangeably. It's there you go.
There you go.
That is at the level of saying you don't find the word Trinity in the Bible. I pointed out to him in the debate, like if you're going to make that argument about church offices, trace the word diakonos, the word for deacon. It is used to describe Jesus. It's used to describe the woman Phoebe. It's used to describe, I believe, Paul himself. It's used to describe several people we know are not just deacons. And it's ironically never used to describe the calling of the first 7 deacons in Acts 6. Like, it is just a bad argument. There is no place where, in a technical sense of episkopos and presbyteros, they're used in a way that signals that they're interchangeable. There is a description about presbyters presiding, presbyters overseeing, which could mean that those are the same office, but you're trying to build a whole lot on really flimsy terminological grounds. What I pointed out to him is, like, if you want to, the question you should be asking is, was there one person overseeing each local church? And the answer to that is clearly yes. You get that in Revelation 1-3 with the 7 angels of the 7 churches who he acknowledges are pastors. Okay, great. Well, it's one guy over an entire church, not just like a local church, like the citywide church. There's one guy. You've got the letters to Timothy and to Titus, where he talks about the power that they have to ordain and to oversee the presbyters, and the presbyters are reporting to them. So Timothy and Titus are clearly in the role of monoepiscopos, even though he doesn't use that term for them. You see the job description. I talk about all this in my book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, by the way. This is the weakest argument to use against the monoepiscopacy. But then since we don't have only the scriptural text to go off of, we have the writings of Ignatius, and he is absolutely clear about the bishop there being one bishop per church and then multiple presbyters. And at one point he even names the bishop, the presbyters, and the deacon. And so we don't have to speculate because he greets them by name and we know they're not the same people.
So I've always posed it this way when I was convinced. In fact, I was a Baptist. I was a Baptist pastor for 8 years. And when I was doing Baptist research at a Baptist seminary for a Baptist doctorate degree, I had to study the manuscript that consisted of the 7 letters of Ignatius and the longer recension, First Clement, Second Clement, Epistle, Barnabas, Didache, etc. I started noticing the bishopric. The first thing that took me out of the Baptist church was the undeniable consensus in those documents alone that showed that there is a bishopric that is distinct from the presbyter. But what I came to realize is this, and I used to say it this way: all bishops are presbyters, but not all presbyters are bishops. Because to be a bishop, you had been a deacon, you had been a presbyter, and then you were elected to the office of bishop. So even if you talk to a priest today, they're always seen as a deacon too, because they'll always be a servant, because they had to be a servant before they could be a priest. To be a bishop, you got to be a priest to be a bishop. And so there are times where the office may be interchangeable because all bishops are elders or presbyters, but not every presbyter is a bishop or an overseer. So there is a distinction in what Dr. White's doing in Titus 1. He's like, well, see right here, they're used interchangeably, but what about when they're used distinct? Right. So what it means is that you're probably wrong about this, but right at the same time. You're right that they're used interchangeably, but when they're not used interchangeably, you have to have a better excuse for that. My answer is, well, I mean, it makes perfect sense. If all overseers or all bishops are presbyters and deacons, I shouldn't be shocked to see a bishop doing deacon work or acting like a deacon at times, or being a presbyter or functioning as a presbyter, or vice versa, whatever the situation is. That's how we explain the similar at times, but different at other times, is because they are a bishop is functionally a deacon, presbyter, and a bishop, because he was all three. He's been all three. To be a bishop, you got to go through that whole entire process. We even see that in these letters. Like you said, Joe, he lists them by name, deacons by name. He lists presbyters by name.
He
absolutely
greets Damas, your most worthy bishop, your worthy presbyters, Bassus and Apollonius, and my fellow servant, the deacon Socio. So
distinct.
A challenge I always raise for people who make the claim James White's making is, can you point to one church in history where you can name who the co-ruling presbyter bishops were? And so far, nobody has ever been able to do that. It's always just like, oh, trust me, bro. They're all like all the early churches. And then it's worse than that, because as you trace the evidence in early Christianity, we have literally hundreds of church records from little churches across North Africa that were all, distinct dioceses or distinct churches. And none of them have a different model. So if this is some kind of church invention, every church on earth erred in exactly the same direction. And as the church fathers are saying, that's not the nature of error. That's the nature of truth. Like when people are wrong, they're not all wrong in the same way. They're wrong in opposite ways. Like think about all the different Trinitarian heresies. They disagree one with another. So when you have everybody who allegedly is going wrong in the same way, to the point that your view is literally not found on earth, that's a sign that maybe you're the one in the wrong.
And it would take a global conspiracy to pull that off. If you have churches in the East and churches in the West all using bishopric, and then they were just doing it for power dominance or something like that, and everybody just kind of followed suit. Nobody opposed this. Nobody rose up and said, no, excuse me, we don't want to go under that type of governments for the church. I mean, you would have seen anytime there was a change to the system, we see major rise. We see major councils have to be called together to deal with it. My goodness, just circumcision alone called for a council. I mean, you think if they're starting, the apostles are now dead off, and these guys like Polycarp in Smyrna and Ignatius in Antioch and Clement in Rome are all of a sudden saying, "Yep, we're bishops. We're in charge of the church now. The apostles are dead." You don't think somebody would have rose up and said, "Excuse me, we're against this. Can we talk about this?"
I mean, it's a coup.
Schism.
You're suggesting that there was a silent coup where there were like co-ruling elders. One guy just asserts control for himself, and everybody else is just like, "Oh yeah, I guess that's fine." And every church on earth, I mean, you
Not a
have to not
chance.
only not understand history, you have to kind of not understand humanity to imagine that's a plausible theory of evidence, because there is nothing. We have nobody talking about this big dispute. We have nobody, recording it at the time. And so, if I can add to that, in Ignatius's epistle to the Trallians, and you can tell me if this is in all of the recensions or not, it talks about how apart from the threefold structure, so it's chapter 3, says, in like manner, let all reverence the deacons as an appointment of Jesus Christ, and the bishop as Jesus Christ, who is Son of the Father, and the presbyters as the Sanhedrin of God and assembly of the apostles. Apart from these, there is no church. And so when Ignatius uses the term church, he doesn't mean an invisible body of believers. He doesn't just mean all the faithful gathered together in whatever way they choose. He has a particular meaning that is a structured society with this three-tiered structure, which is believed to have come from God. That's either an astonishingly early error nobody is correcting, or a sign that there's a reason the church is unified on this.
Well, and he builds on that, Joe, in his letter to the Smyrnans, which was brought up, but not this section. He says, let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one whom he is entrusted it to. That's the presbyter, so there's obviously a distinction. There's one bishop or one of the ones he's entrusted it to, because he mentions the deacons as well. Wherever the bishop shall appear, let there be a multitude of people also, even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is a church, a Catholic church. It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate the love feast, being the Eucharist, by but whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. Secure and valid. These were safeguards. Having a bishop or so this came up into your debate about priesthood too. Like, to me, whether you're talking about persona Christi or something like that, getting into these discussions, you even find that in these letters to the Smyrnans. By the way, that's in the middle and longer recension here. It's in both. So where the bishop is, he is actually doing things that please God. He is representing God in this sacrifice or in this mass, and the people are coming to it. And if there isn't this representative there, people should not baptize, should not do the love feast, and they're not doing it securely, and they're not doing it with validity. Those are big claims. It sounds like something, like if somebody would have read that and didn't know it was Ignatius, they'd say, oh, that was something written in the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s. Right. That's what they would say. But this, we're talking about, this is in Ignatius's letter, and it's in a non-disputed section of his writings between the recensions. I don't know your thoughts on that, but he's basically saying for there to be the presence of Christ. This is so early. Yeah. For the presence of Christ to be there and to be valid, the bishop or a designated person, presbyter, has to be doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty astonishing. Like, unless this is why I think that the most dangerous thing he can do is just kick up dust. Because if you have a question about a particular passage, fine. But if all you're doing is calling into question things that you know are early second century writings, or at the very late second century writings, I don't even think that's a good argument, but granting the strongest form that maybe it's late second century instead of early second century, this is calling into question so much of the kind of popular Baptist narrative about church history. And just own that and be honest with it and deal honestly with the evidence. Don't pretend it doesn't exist.
Well, was there anything that we haven't talked about you guys wanted to talk about with respect to this particular issue? We have a little bit more time. It's up to you guys.
Let me say this too. Some of the Baptists that I know would say that they do recognize an early bishopric, but that it no longer is needed. It was only needed for a certain time and a place. I actually have more respect for that, as crazy as I think it is. I have more respect for that answer to say, because you're admitting, yes, there was
the distinction
a bishopric that was set up.
Right.
But we just don't need it anymore. Now they have to do a lot of work, and they try to do a lot of work. Like, well, what about these people that thought they were popes at the same time? Therefore, we really lost it somewhere. I mean, so there's really no point. We don't need it anymore. Like that's where they go. But they at least can read these texts and go, sure, yeah, there was a bishopric there. I mean, it's pretty obvious they had one, so why deny it? We just think it got corrupted over time to the point we don't need it.
Yeah, if I can give one piece of encouragement to everyone watching, like read the actual historical evidence and be willing to have your assumptions about church history challenged, and maybe even your assumptions about theology challenged. Because so many of us, we come from a worldview where we're presented a particular vision of Christianity. And if it turns out your version of Christianity is something very parochial and very modern, that is tied to a particular time and place and isn't the 2,000-year-old Christianity that Jesus gives us, hopefully you love Jesus more than you love your local parochial man-made traditions. And you're willing to allow yourself to be really challenged in that way. That's not easy, but do the actual work, like read the actual church fathers. And I think there's a reason why Catholics constantly encourage you to do that, because I've never seen someone who is a devoted Catholic read the church fathers and be like, I need to leave for Protestantism. I've seen that door go the opposite direction more times than I can count.
Yeah, there's a buddy of mine who that exact situation happened to. He read St. Ignatius and it like rocked his world. It changed his life.
Yeah.
I can't even echo that enough. It has been a hard journey for me, my wife. We've been working through so much of this. I mean, again, I was a Baptist pastor from the age of 20. I started right out of seminary as a pastor. I was an independent Baptist. I was a Southern Baptist, and I lost friends. I've lost people that I trusted as mentors because I started changing my view on these very things. I started believing in liturgical practices. I started believing in a bishopric. I started believing in the real presence. I mean, these things all became major. And it's, but I'll tell you this, my wife and I were talking about this the other night. We would never be able to go back. We were reading a quote from Lord of the Rings. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. If you could see my camera right now, I've got a whole collection on my wall here of Tolkien books, figures, everything. And one of the things that Gandalf talks about was the inflicted pain that Frodo had from being stabbed by the Witch of Endor. And one of the things that Agmar, excuse me, one of the things that he said was that some wounds don't fully heal. And Frodo responded with this statement. He said, I fear that is what I have. He said, even if I go back to the Shire, I will not be the same. I will not be the same, because he had seen too much. He knew too much. And Claire and I were talking about this the other night. Like, we were thinking about our world, what we were, where we were, with who we knew. Could we ever go back to that world? Sure, we'd have friends, we'd have good conversations, but we could never exist in that world again. And it's because of what Frodo said. I have changed. Those worlds that I lived in didn't change. The church that I was going to, they're just being them. I told them that when I told them we were leaving, I was like, it's not you, it's us. I felt like that old girlfriend breakup line. Like, it's not you, it's me. It really is, you know?
Yeah.
It really is us. You didn't do anything different. You're being you. We changed. Yep. We studied. We're not the same. And we could never go back and be the same, even if we wanted to try to find comfort. And so I would echo what Joe just said. Like, it is painful. It means you got to be uncomfortable. You've got to admit you're wrong about a lot of things. But man, it is freeing to finally embrace something and look at Christianity in its fullness and say, man, it makes sense from A to Z. It all connects. It all works together. And there's something freeing about that, even though it's painful to deal with the ramifications.
Beautiful witness. Hey, Cameron, I know in one of the super chats, somebody asked me a page number.
I was about to pull up.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah,
I've got it right here. It's page 253. So there you go.
Nice.
I know. I'm coming down from like that beautiful witness to this very like in the weeds. Yeah, it's page 253. But how is it going to follow that?
Yeah. Here's another super
wonderful.
chat. Yeah, I was one of the few Catholics in attendance. Thanks again for signing my book, Joe. And he made the accusation of Catholics retroactively changing history, scripture to suit our needs. Ironic.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, that's such an ugly move of like, you're a Catholic, so you can't do scholarship. Like it just plays upon what he assumes is going to be the bigotry of the crowd, that you don't have to listen to these Catholics. And the hilarious part about it, if you watch, is I had just quoted an Anglican, Gregory Dix, on this question, saying nobody in the early church whose Eucharistic writings we have in a full form denies this. The line is this: there is no pre-Nicene author, Eastern or Western, whose Eucharistic doctrine is at all fully stated, Who does not regard the offering and consecration of the Eucharist as the present action of our Lord himself, the second person of the Trinity? Now, you'll notice it's confusing because there's a double negative. He's saying nobody denies that it is the present action of our Lord. And in the overwhelming majority of figures, it is made clear that their whole conception revolves around the figure of the high priest in the altar in heaven. That is, if you read the early Christians, they're unanimous of everyone we have that what Christ is doing in heaven is in some way instantiated in the liturgy on earth, that we're not doing some second sacrifice. We're participating in the once for all eternal sacrifice offered by Christ to the Father. Now, I make this argument, and James seizes upon that language. No father whose Eucharistic doctrine is at all fully stated. It's like, well, sure. I mean, if you find somebody on the street who doesn't write about the Eucharist, you can project whatever beliefs you want onto them. But that's not how real scholarship works. It can't just be like, well, that lady in Hippo, she didn't say anything. I bet she was a Baptist. Like, that's not a serious objection. So every known person agrees in a very specific way about Eucharistic sacrificial theology in a way that totally contradicts and undermines James's reading of the Hebrews, which is really all he has to throw back at it.
Do you guys have time for a question, Stephen?
Sure.
There's a question on First Clement that I wanted to see if we could squeeze in. Tony L says, "What does Stephen Boyce think about First Clement 40-42 regarding Christian priests and sacrifices?"
Do you have it pulled up, or do I need to pull it up?
Oh, I can pull it up. I didn't know if you knew it off the top of your head. I didn't know if they knew who you were, and maybe
I don't have it memorized.
This is the part where he talks about the roles of the high priest, Levite, and layman.
Oh yeah,
in the context of getting Christians to obey.
Okay, so what is the specific question? Can you?
I think I can give some framework to it. I made the argument,
and he can comment if we're misrepresenting him. How about that?
Yeah, that's right. I believe I made the comment in the debate that I understand what's going on there in First Clement as being an intentional parallelism. Like if you take the later dating of Clement, when he talks about how it's important that everyone follow their roles because the high priest, the priest, the deacon, and the high priest, the priest, the Levite, and the layman each have their own proper services. He's using this explicitly offering sacrificial language in using the kind of temple as an image, but in the context of telling not Jewish clergy to do their job, but a group of Christians that he's writing to, not to overthrow their presbyters. So I view that as an early sign, both of the threefold nature of bishop, presbyter, deacon, the fulfillment of high priest, Levite, but also extremely kind of obvious offertory language.
No, I think you're 100% right, because when you're looking at it, he is paralleling the ideas that are there, because the deacons serve kind of as the Levites, like you said, and then you also have the priests that are patterning themselves, and then the high priest being that bishopric who oversees the work of the other priests doing their offerings as well. But it's interesting because one of the things, I think I have this, and I sent it, I'll have to pull it up, because one of the points where he quotes the Old Testament, he says, the scripture in a certain place says, I will appoint their bishops in righteousness and their deacons in faith. That's in chapter 42. He actually kind of does a reconstruction of the Old Testament passage. It doesn't read anything like it does in our Hebrew. Naturally, he's quoting from the Septuagint everywhere. But I think that what Clement is doing, we have to remember that they were actually running leaders out of their church because they were actually serving like Congregationalists. And this is why they're getting the letter that they're getting, because in First Clement, they were running leaders out of the church the same way you would see a Baptist do it when they don't like their pastor anymore. They just call a secret meeting, you vote them out. There was a removal of leaders in the church, and Clement is actually rebuking this action, and he's trying to set up order, and he's giving them all kinds of techniques and purposes for this order. And he chooses in this section, if I understand the question correctly, he's choosing to set up the old priestly order within the tabernacle, within the temple, to show to us in the church that we're also participating in a sacrifice. We're also participating, but in a greater and a better one. And he's using these offices from the high priest into a priest into a deacon. And then he even uses an Old Testament passage to try to point that out by even using those same exact words. And he's saying that we have this same setup, so we need to follow same order, because what is at stake here is if you're removing the hierarchy, you're removing the opportunity of sacrifice. You're removing the opportunity of having community with God again, because without a sacrifice, there's no community with God, because there has to be an atonement. There has to be a washing. There has to be a cleansing in order for there to be a relationship with God, for God to be with his people with their God. So his point is if you're removing the hierarchy, just swinging off the hand here, you're actually damaging you and your relationship with the Lord, because they are serving in your place. Now, I don't know if I'm answering his question, but Joe, I'm kind of trying to piggyback off what you're saying, because I'm trying to remember what you said in the debate. But that is exactly what he's doing here based on what was happening in the church of Corinth. And he has to remind them that Paul had already rebuked them. He references 1 Corinthians in this letter to the Corinthians about their schisms. This schism isn't so much of we're with this guy, we're with that guy. It's like, we just kicked this guy out. That was the issue. They created schism by removing leaders and having congregations actually move the leader out when a leader shouldn't be removed by his congregation.
So Joe, before you come back, I was going to say Tony L followed up and said, "Is this good evidence of Christian priests and sacrifices in the first century?"
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. The problem with it is that you have to be able to read it at a deeper level. You know, like
it's true.
Take the ongoing, controversy over did Peter go to Rome? And you've got 1 Peter 5, which says he goes to Babylon. If you know how to read scripture, if you know the context, if you know the Jewish way that, like in the Sibylline oracles, the city of Rome is called Babylon, then it's very clear that yes, he did. If you take a surface level read of scripture alone, then you're going to get exactly the wrong answer. Well, you can do that same thing of having a superficial read of the church fathers. And so here, when he quotes the past, what is it, Isaiah 60, verse 17, about giving you officers in peace and bishops in righteousness. I've seen people point to that and be like, see, clearly there is only a twofold office, because, Clement doesn't explicitly say there's actually three, but that's a very surfacey kind of reading. If you understand what he's doing with that parallel, then it makes a lot of sense. And this is not alone. Like Clement presents this as the threefold fulfillment of the threefold priestly office of the Old Covenant, but so do a lot of other sources in the early church. So, for instance, I know in some of the anti-Arian writings, it talks about Arius only having the dignity of a Levite, meaning he was a deacon. Peter of Alexandria says that. Justin Martyr, I think, talks about this as well. Actually, you know what? Yeah, Justin Martyr. So I quoted him earlier that in every place among the Gentiles, sacrifices are being presented to his name, about the Eucharistic sacrifice. In the very next verse, he says, now God receives sacrifices from no one except through his priests. Now, it's very clear. He's just said there's a Eucharistic sacrifice and thus a Eucharistic priesthood. And that's like 150. So if you read the first century evidence as in harmony with the middle second century evidence, then it all makes sense. If you read some sort of invisible revolution in theology happened, then you can read them as disharmonious. But I think that's a bad reading. I would err to the side of, if earlier and slightly later authors appear to agree with each other, you should assume that they agree with each other. If they appear to disagree with each other, like if they think they're disagreeing, then look for a disagreement. But if they think they agree, don't read a disagreement in where one doesn't exist. Like the workaround I've seen from a lot of Protestants is to claim that some, you kind of have to say at least some of the early Christians have a Catholic view of the Eucharist, unless you're James White. Like unless you're going to just ignore all the evidence from the first 1,000 years, you have to at least say some of the early Christians believe this, because they're so explicit you can't get around it. And then others you can they're murky enough. They're not clear about every disputed question, so you can maybe pretend that they are a different camp. But the problem with that is, if they really have two separate views on an issue like the Eucharist, why are they not fighting? Like, we find the early Christians fighting about way dumber stuff. Like, read Jerome's letters to almost anybody, and it's like, here he is fighting about whether he should have used this line from the longer form of Daniel. Or no, sorry, that's actually Origen. Origen argues with Africanus about that. Jerome argues with Augustine, and he argues with a bunch of other people on things way less significant. Like, we know, just to give since I mentioned Augustine, I've heard James White claim that Augustine holds to like a Protestant view of the Eucharist. We know, as a matter of fact, not only from Augustine's own writings, but from the writings of his teacher, Ambrose of Milan, that this isn't true. To imagine that Augustine is radically rejecting everything he was trained in as a Christian, and nobody noticed it or commented on it, again, like you're inventing a dispute rather than just reading them through a hermeneutic of continuity.
Well, I think
Stephen,
that goes back to the fact
I know you gotta head out quickly, so
no, you're good.
Free to,
well, my only point was, of course, these guys are not going to sit here and write with our terminology in modern day debates about this, because there wasn't a debate for them. There was no debate, so they didn't feel like they had to elaborate on every single thing. It was just functionally true, and they don't need to sit there and repeat themselves over and over and over again. I tell people all the time, like, if you're alive in the United States today, I don't have to always clarify when I say the president of the United States is Donald Trump. I can just say the president and everybody knows what I mean. I don't have to clarify, because people alive are already under the assumption of the reality that exists. They don't have to constantly come back at this. By the way, the passage here that he is quoting is Isaiah 60:17. And I will point out that it's interesting for the word that is used here. He inserts the word diakonos in 1 Clement 42. But if you go to the Septuagint, in the translation of the Hebrew word here, archontos is the Greek word that he uses, which is typically ruler. So we're actually not even sure what Clement's doing here. I actually was looking at my textual data that I compiled and all my charts and stuff when going through Clement. We're not even sure what he's quoting. We don't have a manuscript or even a Hebrew link. The Hebrew and the Septuagint actually seem to agree each other with the idea of ruler. He actually goes with the word servant here. So we're actually not exactly sure what Clement is doing, or if he has a manuscript of the Septuagint that actually has this reading. But he thought it was important enough to say, see, this was already talked about by the prophets, where, and it just could be because he's summarizing, or he's not actually sitting there quoting something and then writing by a copy. He's just going off a memory or a statement. And he seems to attach these prophecies about things that would come by God leading his people. He was pointing to the fact this was always going to be the church, and it was going to come to the office of the bishopric and the service of the deacons, patterning itself after the Old Testament. But again, if Clement is saying, as Joe was talking, if Clement is saying that these things are happening, to have a high priest, you got to have priests. Because there wasn't just a priest. There was a high priest. He's called the high priest because it means he's obviously seen as a leader amongst other priests. And we have all the scripture in the world to support that idea. So you had the high priest and his other priests, and then you had Levites, deacons, serving. And so, yes, absolutely, to answer the question, there is a pattern here. He's even using weird readings that we're not even sure where he's getting it from Isaiah 60 to show us that this was always intended by God to have the church organized and led this way. So don't just kick leaders out because you don't like them. That's basically what he's saying in the section.
All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap up the stream today. And I think the proper way to do this is to just wish Joe another happy birthday, and hopefully you get to enjoy some time off. You're like working on your birthday here.
Oh my gosh, doing a live
stream
stream with you two is not, that doesn't feel like work.
Oh, nice. Okay. I'll take it. No, but yeah, I had a great time. I thought this was very fruitful. And like I said at the very beginning of this, like the whole point of this was actually kind of just to nerd out on some stuff for a little while on some topics that normally would just, if I were to just do a random stream on St. Ignatius, like we wouldn't get nearly as many views as we're getting on this topic. So it allows us, like focusing on these different topics allows us to talk about some really cool stuff that otherwise people just wouldn't be interested in. So that's one of the main reasons why we did this and wanted to talk about it. But Stephen, Joe, thank you guys for joining me. By the way, Stephen has a YouTube channel. You guys need to go check it out. Remind me the name of it one more time so people can go check it out.
It's an acronym, FACTS. Just had Carl Broussard on talking about purgatory the other day. Just released that. It's also on any of your favorite platforms, Spotify. We're actually much, but we've only been on YouTube for a year now, but we've been doing the podcast for 3. So make sure you check that one out.
Nice.
Carl is a stud. Shameless Popery. And, I work at Catholic Answers too. So you'll find me at both those places.
Nice. And you can find me on Capturing Christianity, the place that you're actually watching this. So if you guys want to subscribe and like and do all the things, please do. And by the way, we do need your support right now. There's a lot of different things that we have planned in the works, including getting into a new studio. So we do need your help. If you want to support Capturing Christianity, go to patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. Got a link in the description of the video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. See you guys later.